I'm going to mute all entries, everyone on entry, and I'm going to admit now.
Oh, Counselor.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another lifelong learning lecture. Very happy to have you tonight, and very happy to
Guy
have
who's
you
going to
with
be
us
talking.
once again.
That's
And
a
I'm going
guy.
to ask, if you have not already, if you would please mute yourselves. Thank you. Anyway, as I was saying, we are very pleased to have with us once again Dr. Joseph Adelman, Professor of History at FSU. He's here tonight to give us his talk, The Shot Heard Round the World, 250 years ago this week. And I am Tara Hall. I am a program specialist here at the Framingham Public Library. And before we get started, I just have a few things to note. If you haven't already, I'm going to ask that you please mute yourselves. If you haven't done it, I will mute you. I will be dropping into the chat a link to our evaluation form. We welcome any ideas you have for future lectures and any comments you have about tonight's lecture as well. When it comes to Q&A, I'm going to ask that you reserve or drop your questions rather into the chat. And at the end of the lecture, I will read those questions out to Dr. Adelman, who will answer them for you.
Yes,
And with that, Dr. Adelman, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Tara. And thank you to you and everyone at the Framingham Public Library, and to Anne Roberti over at Framingham State, who coordinates the Lifelong Learning Series from that side. And thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. I know there are a lot of events related to Lexington and Concord this week and tonight, and so I very much appreciate that you picked our talk as part of your celebration of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, not the Declaration of Independence, sorry, of Lexington and Concord this week. I will not be able to say everything about Lexington and Concord, but I will try to give us some background on the lead up, the events of that day, some of the aftermath. I do want to say at the outset, I think it's important to say in this particular moment that much of my research on the Revolutionary era that I did for the book that I wrote, and much of the research that I draw on in this talk, a lot of the other scholarship that I've read were funded. The research was funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, which earlier this month had all of its funding cut, and so many future projects have lost funding that might otherwise have been there for this same kind of work. With that, I will share my slides, and we will go ahead and get going. So as you know, if you watch the news, if you look around, if you happen to be trying to drive through Lexington or Lincoln or Concord or Carlisle or any of those towns this week, there is a lot going on to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the start of the American Revolution in April of 1775. Like I said, my goal is to give you a little bit of background. I'm happy to answer questions and talk in more detail in the Q&A, and just encourage you to keep seeking out these conversations and these kinds of programs so that we can continue to talk and continue to learn more. Okay, so to get started on understanding Lexington and Concord, I want to back up a step to 1774. This is material that I talked about last fall in a talk for the Lifelong Learning Series. So if you attended that and have an outstanding memory, you can double check me. And if not, it'll be a 3 to 5 minute little refresher to give you some background and context. So after the Boston Tea Party in December of 1773, the British Parliament responded with a series of laws that have become known as the Intolerable Acts. And here's Boston. We'll come back to them in a little bit. These Intolerable Acts in total took authority away from colonists and local officials and placed control over Massachusetts in the hands of the Empire, and specifically gave the British Army much more power. So there are four really, and then the Quebec Act is sort of floating around there in the same vein. The Port Act closes the port until payment is made for the tea that was dumped. The Quartering Act makes it much easier for the British Army to put soldiers in houses. The Impartial Administration of Justice Act allows for British officials in Massachusetts to, when they arrest someone, to send them overseas to either Halifax or to London for trial. And the Massachusetts Government Act ends the Charter of 1691 and makes the commander-in-chief of the British Army, General Thomas Gage, the governor of Massachusetts. Okay. Most of these acts take effect on June 1st, 1774. And what happens then in the months that follow is that the British lose control over day-to-day authority of what happens everywhere outside of Boston. They are only able to exert authority where they have troops. Thomas Gage has about 3,500 troops, and there is Thomas pointing at some of his in his portrait. And so that's the only area that he can control. Whatever the political persuasion, patriot, loyalist, neutral, people are just outside the control of Gage's authority. He can say whatever he wants, but people don't feel obligated to listen based on his claim to authority. As part of the acts, Gage dissolves the Massachusetts General Court. Excuse me. He dissolves the General Court, which is the legislative body in the colony. They cross the river and reconstitute themselves as a provincial congress and say, we are representing the people, and we will act on behalf of the colony in the absence of imperial authority. It is important to note at this point in summer, fall of 74, winter of 1775, pretty much everybody, the mainstream, Massachusetts is a colony of the Kingdom of Great Britain, and everyone considers themselves a subject of King George III, the sovereign monarch of Great Britain. They're upset with government ministers, they're upset with imperial officials, they consider themselves British subjects. There are moments, though, where the tension begins to appear to be ready to boil over, and one of the most famous of these, the anniversary was last fall, is called the Powder Alarm. So this is the Powder House. It still exists over in Somerville in the cleverly titled Powder House Square. On September 1st of 1774, Gage sent a small group of soldiers to seize the gunpowder that was being stored in this powder house. It belonged to the province. It belonged to the colony. He had the right to it. He went and seized it before it could be taken by colonists. Word spread about this action, some of it accurate, some of it rumor, and by the time news got west to Worcester and then into Connecticut, into New Hampshire, the rumor had gotten more and more embellished to the point that people were reporting that Gage had ordered the Royal Navy to fire on Boston, that dozens of people were dead. And so the towns responded by mustering their militia and starting to march to Boston, ready to fight. The news got at least as far as Pomfret, Connecticut, which is in eastern Connecticut. And that was the home of the decorated war veteran Israel Putnam, whose name may be familiar. If you're a 7 Years' War fan, he's familiar from that. He also has some Revolutionary War exploits ahead of him. He immediately started writing letters. He roused his neighbors. They were ready to march. And as they were on the mustering green in the town the next morning, only then did they get a rider coming through town saying, hold on, that rumor was false. It was just this other thing. But it's clear, in New England at least, in the fall of 1774, that colonists are ready and willing to take up arms to defend what they believe their rights are. It is a contingency of history that violence started on April 19th, 1775, and it's a contingency that it did not start at any of these other dates. Um, in the fall, 12 colonies met in Philadelphia as a Continental Congress. Uh, as a result of that, they formed what was known as a Continental Association that planned and organized systematic economic resistance. So boycotts, non-importation agreements, non-consumption. We're not going to buy, we're not going to consume various goods. They also sent appeals to colonists in Canada and to the Irish to join them in their defensive rights against Great Britain. Neither of them was interested. So, through the winter of 1775 into January, February, March, um, tensions rose in and around Boston. Trade was disrupted by the Continental Association, so there's an economic depression in town. Boston, as you might imagine, was once a thriving port, and not importing and not buying British goods put a significant dent in the economy, and Gage is struggling to maintain control. Then in late January, ships arrived in North America carrying the King's speech to the opening of Parliament, which had taken place in November of 1774. Um, Anyone who thought that George III was going to come to the colonists' defense was disappointed. He suggested that Massachusetts was demonstrating, quote, a most daring spirit of resistance and disobedience to the law. And so people reacted accordingly. After reading the speech, Abigail Adams wrote to her friend Mercy Otis Warren, quote, the die is cast. Yesterday brought us such a speech from the throne as will stain with everlasting infamy the reign of George III. So Abigail, at least, is ready to go. Um, During this winter, there were a series of open secrets around Boston. Everybody knew that colonists throughout Massachusetts were taking up serious training and drilling in their militias. It was standard for men ages 16 to 60, with a few exceptions, to be part of their town militia and to muster and drill 4 times a year. That was something that people took more or less seriously depending on the moment. This was a moment when they took it particularly seriously. Everybody knew that the colonists were secretly stockpiling weapons and ammunition in a variety of places around the colony. Everybody knew that there were spies operating in Boston on both sides, trying to glean information about the next moves for the British and their opponents. Among these was actually a supposed patriot, Dr. Benjamin Church, who was a member of the Committee of Correspondence and part of the Sons of Liberty, and also sending reports secretly to Gage, and he would not be found out for another several months until well after the fighting had started. Everybody also knew, and I think I talked about this, and Framingham History Center has had events on this. Everybody knew that Gage was sending out spies of his own to investigate all of this action, all of the stockpiling. And in February of 1775, that included a stop in Framingham at Buckminster's Tavern on the way to Worcester, where Captain Brown and Ensign de Bernier received a less than pleasant welcome in Framingham because everybody knew who they were. Uh, that brings us in towards April. In April, Gage receives a letter from Lord Dartmouth, who is the Secretary of State for North America. He's the British official overseeing for the government the North American colonies. Dartmouth tells Gage it's time to make some arrests. He orders him to arrest, quote, the principal actors and abettors in the provincial congress, and also to seize weapons stores. That letter arrives in mid-April, and word gets out. So once we get past April 10th, once we get into the double-digit days, people are aware that something is up, and people start moving, even as Gage is trying to keep his next move secret. So this is the moment. I have written a lot about newspapers, so I refer to my newspaper printers. The Patriot printers start to leave town. They pack up their printing presses and leave. Eads and Gill, who were the printers of the Boston Gazette, which was the most famous newspaper sponsored by the Sons of Liberty, they flee across the Charles over to Watertown. Isaiah Thomas, who's a young firebrand and publisher of the Massachusetts Spy, he had befriended Timothy Bigelow, who was a Patriot leader out in Worcester. And so he spirits his press out to Worcester at that point. So people are starting to say it's getting too dangerous if I'm a patriot to be inside Boston at this moment. On April 18th, 1775, Gage turns to his Lieutenant Colonel, Francis Smith, and gives him orders to travel to Concord with an expeditionary force and seize what he thought to be a store of weapons and ammunition, including several cannon that were used by the Boston militia. His plan was to just send a small, quick force, march out, seize the stuff, get back before anything could happen. Um, as a side note, the colonists had figured this out, that this was going to happen in some way. And so they were already working to move the goods, move the stores out of Concord. There was not a lot left by the morning of April 19th. Um, in the meantime, Gage had no intention that we know of in his orders to arrest anyone, even though Dartmouth told him to, Lord Dartmouth. Um, but the colonists knew that John Hancock and Samuel Adams, two of the most prominent leaders, were spending that night in the town of Lexington at the home of the Reverend Jonas Clark at the parsonage just off of the Lexington Green. Many of the colonists assumed, as part of the rumors swirling around, that they were being targeted as well, and the troops marching on the road in the direction directly through Lexington uh, certainly helped them in that belief. But they were not so much, so far as we know, the target. That evening, April 18th, the various Boston spies were gathering information through a network that included a silversmith named Paul Revere, who you may have heard of, and William Dawes. The plan was for them to all ride out into the countryside with whatever news was needed to be spread by different routes to try and help. Paul Revere also arranged with the Anglican Church in the North End, the Old North Church, to light lamps in the Belfry Tower to aid people on the other side of the river with knowing what was happening in case Revere and or Dawes was unable to get through. As it happened, Dawes, whose job was to go out through Boston Neck through the overland route, he somehow managed to talk his way past the sentries and was able to ride south through Dorchester, Jamaica Plain area, and make his way towards Lexington from around that side. Revere was rode across the Charles River to Charlestown and was able to ride from there, from Charlestown through Cambridge, through Menotomy, which is what now is the town of Arlington, um, into Lexington. Dawes and Revere meet at Lexington. They go to Hancock and Adams at the Clark parsonage, tell them what's happening, tell them that they probably should get moving, and Hancock and Adams very quickly pack up and leave. They then meet up with another man named Samuel Prescott, who also agrees to work with them to ride on to Concord with them to warn the people of Concord. As they're riding in each town, they are pausing, they are announcing that the soldiers are marching out. It's important to note that, or at least when I was a kid, I learned that Revere rode through town shouting, "The British are coming, the British are coming." He wouldn't have shouted that. They all thought of themselves as British, so he would have said something like, "The regulars are marching, the regulars are turning out," something more along those lines. But he would stop in each town center, make sure that enough people were awake to tell everybody else, and then continue on riding through to the next town. Uh, while trying to travel between Lexington and Concord, Revere, Dawes, and Prescott were stopped by some British guards who were advance guard. Revere and Dawes were arrested and held. They weren't charged; they were held just for the day. Prescott managed to slip away, and he is the only one then to get to Concord to warn the people of Concord that their stores of ammunition are a target. Um, okay. We could do, well, we could do the whole day on the battle, but I wanted to make sure that there was a map of the battle lines and the marching. Um, it takes a long time to move an army across the Charles River when all you have are rowboats. So the British soldiers are secretly awakened on Lexington Common late in the evening. They pack up, they board rowboats. It takes them several hours to get situated at Charlestown, and then they begin marching west through Charlestown, through Menotomy, which again is now Arlington, into Lexington. It takes them until about daybreak, as you may recall, where they meet with a group of militia from the town of Lexington who have gathered at the Green. One of the things that's important to remember is that the colonists, they had a lot right. One of the things they did not know correctly was that Lexington was not a target, and Adams and Hancock weren't a target. The Francis Smith, the British Army force, was expecting just to march through Lexington. Instead, they were stopped. They ordered the Lexington militiamen to disperse and to drop their weapons. Now, this is one of the mysteries of history. This is if you're allowed to ask questions when you get to the next place, this is on my list of questions. Um, According to accounts, the men of Lexington were willing to disperse and began doing that, but did not put down their weapons. At some point in the middle of this interaction, a shot was fired, and nobody knows who did it. Everyone points at somebody else, and not in a way that we've ever been able to sort out to make some sort of claim about who fired that first shot, what later gets referred to as the shot heard round the world. However, hearing that shot, in the same way that in the confusion at the Boston Massacre, the British soldiers fired, at Lexington Green, the soldiers fire, kill nine Lexington residents before the commanders, who really didn't want to get into this fight, regather their soldiers and continue the march to Concord. This is the first American blood that's been spilled by a British soldier since the Boston Massacre in 5 years. And obviously, it would not be the last. Um, the regiment keeps marching. They arrive in Concord around 9:30, 10 a.m. The colonists abandon the center of town, and the British begin searching through town for weapons in basements, in outhousing, in barns, and right in all sorts of places. Um, there's some brief skirmishing. Um, there then is this battle at the North Bridge, where it becomes clear that the British are not going to accomplish much of anything. Um, at which point the commanders order a retreat, and the regiment begins marching back to Boston. By this time, which is around noon, 12 hours have passed in which towns around Massachusetts and even as far as into southern New Hampshire have been alerted to what's going on and have begun sending militiamen to the route that the British are following towards Lexington or towards Concord, or at least towards what we now know as Battle Road. Along the way on the retreat is where the real fighting happens. And if you look at this map, or if you go to the American Battlefield Trust, you can look at it close up. Um, this is when the biggest fighting, the highest casualty fighting happens. There are a number of pitched battles where colonists are taking on British soldiers, their own nations, their own sovereign monarchs' soldiers, in gunfights along the way. And I hope if you've never had a chance to visit any of those sites that you take advantage at some point, maybe not this weekend. There's going to be a lot of people there this weekend, but some other weekend as the summer comes along. One other thing that is sort of interesting about this, and we often, and this was certainly the way I was taught about it as a kid, couple of decades ago, um, is the idea that the British Army is well trained, which they are. They're the best army in the world, right? They have this, and they're being taken on by these colonists who are just farmers picking up guns, which is true. Except, um, one of the things that the colonists had as an advantage was combat experience over many of the British soldiers. So the British soldiers range in age, but many of them are young. Uh, and so they have not necessarily faced fighting in the 5 or 10 or 12 years that they have served in the British Army. Many of the Massachusetts farmers had faced fighting. Many of them, these older militiamen, had served in militia forces or in the British Army during the Seven Years' War, which ended in 1763. And so they had experience. They had fought against the French. They had fought in Eastern Canada. They had fought in Pennsylvania. They had fought in upstate New York. I guess it would have been up colony New York at that point. And so they had what they lacked in consistent military training. They only met once every 3 months for their militia training. What they could make up for that with actually having been in battle and having some idea of what to do. And so it is a profoundly deadly experience for the Army regiment to make its way back to the relative safety of Charlestown. And I made sure to pull from the American Battlefield Trust an estimated list of casualties. As we've discussed, the first 9 at Lexington were American. But after that, the battle was really towards the Americans. That they had the advantage of understanding the territory, which is crucial in wartime, and they had the advantage of being able to hide and move around, and the soldiers are trying to march down the road, um, and trying to get down. The news then spreads even more widely, um, and it spreads. Drawings there. Um, So it spreads rapidly in part because lots of people, Revere, Dawes, Samuel Prescott, are not the only messengers. Um, at about 10 o'clock in the morning, you can see up at the top, Watertown, Wednesday morning near 10 o'clock, um, Joseph Palmer, member of the Committee of Safety for the town of Watertown, writes a letter um, alerting people that something is happening. And one of the things I appreciate about this letter, we're going to talk about propaganda in a second and battling over the narrative. This is very, we don't know what's happening. We know that troops have landed. We know they're marching towards Concord. We know some people have died at Lexington, but that's about it. That's all they know. Um, so this is known as the Lexington Alarm Letter. There are a few copies remaining. The one that I was able to find digitally is at the Scottish Rite Masonic Museum, which is over in Lexington and has a lot of Lexington related materials. There's also a copy in Philadelphia uh, that actually made it from Watertown all the way to Philadelphia. And what makes it fascinating as a historical source is that each town where they stopped, the rider stopped to get some food, to switch horses, and to alert townspeople, the local committee would sign the letter. I don't have a digital image of that, but I do. There we go. Um, I do have a table that lists out. They would note what time they stopped in each town, and so you can see from looking at this table. I didn't do it in map form, but essentially, this particular rider went west along what would now be Route 20, the Boston Post Road, towards Worcester, turned south along the route that is now I-395 towards New London, then down along the coast along that post road, what's now US Route 1, all the way across the coast of Connecticut, into New York City, across New Jersey, and into Philadelphia. Um, Reaching Philadelphia in just over 5 days. Um, the technical term for that speed is bananas in the 18th century. It is way faster than almost anything could possibly travel. And as you can see from the list, like they are literally riding night and day to spread this news to get it to Philadelphia. To give you a contrast, news between Boston and Philadelphia normally took about 2 weeks. And the previous time they tried to get news quickly was after the Tea Party, and that took 8 days for it to arrive. This is five. Um, 120 hours that it takes to get this news over 300 miles. Um, and it is just a remarkable amount of galloping and work by a series of writers to get the word out as quickly as possible. They had built up networks for this purpose to spread news rapidly and let people know when something was happening. And they put these uh, into play on the morning of April 19th, 1775. Um, they also were able, and this is also very rapid and very quick, able to get news into the newspaper, which reaches even more people than an individual um, reaching out to a town committee can do, so that the news is in Williamsburg, Virginia, within 10 days. Um, which again, it often was 4 weeks from Boston to Williamsburg to get news between those two towns. And they are so on top of spreading this news that they get the news out in 10 days. So that the idea of Lexington and Concord is spreading fast through the Lexington alarm letter. Just that letter is traveling within 10 days. There then follow behind it a series of other accounts as other accounts begin to be produced. And that's really where we get some interesting work happening in terms of trying to battle over who's going to control the narrative of what happened. Um, so when the battle ends and that day is over, Gage has his remaining soldiers back in Boston, and now he really is operating a garrison town that is essentially under siege. He controls Boston. All the Patriots leave if they can. Um, and then they're surrounded by militiamen who are coming in droves by the dozen, surrounding Boston, in Cambridge, in Dorchester, in Watertown, right in these towns that are now either outlying neighborhoods of Boston or near suburbs of the city of Boston. They're beginning to just sort of occupy and set themselves up. They're organizing themselves into companies and regiments. Um, there will be more later. Um, but for now, that's it. Gage immediately writes a letter to Lord Dartmouth reporting on what's happened. There are mistakes that a person can hide from his superior, and there are mistakes that one cannot hide, and so you try to make sure you put the best spin on it. He gets a letter onto a ship as quick as he possibly can. Um, Patriots know that this is going to happen, and so they're doing the same thing. Um, so they're using their newspapers and their information to spread the news. I had mentioned Isaiah Thomas. So he goes out to Worcester and on May 3rd prints the Massachusetts Spy for the first time in Worcester, Massachusetts, um, and is immediately taking part in a propaganda battle. Americans, he writes at the start of his account of the battle, which he witnessed. He took a detour on the way to Worcester to be part of this. Forever bear in mind the Battle of Lexington, where British troops, unmolested and unprovoked wantonly, and in a most inhuman manner, fired upon and killed a number of our countrymen, then robbed them of their provisions, ransacked, plundered, and burnt their houses. Nor could the tears of defenseless women, some of whom were in the pains of childbirth, the cries of helpless babes, nor the prayers of old age confined to beds of sickness, appease their thirst for blood, or divert them from the design of murder and robbery. They were looking for cannon as their order. Um, they were not, certainly not in the main, committing any sort of atrocities that that Thomas is describing. Um, but he's making a pitch for the Americans as defenseless victims of British tyranny. Um, the British, sorry, not the British, the Massachusetts, the provincial Congress authorizes depositions be taken by participants and witnesses of the events of that day and publishes a pamphlet, a 23-page pamphlet with dozens of these accounts taken as depositions, so with the framing of legal devices, as a narrative of the excursion and ravages of the king's troops under the command of General Gage on the 19th of April, 1775, and they spread that around. And they send that to London to their supporters and allies to make the claim that Gage is the one who should be blamed. Gage is the one at fault. We were defending ourselves. You would have done the same thing, and therefore we should be held blameless, and you should deal with Gage. All of this is in the context of thinking about appealing to interests in Britain who could support them and support them in a dispute that they assumed was still within the British Empire and within the realm, not thinking about independence at all. In the meantime, Congress reconvenes, the Continental Congress reconvenes on May 10th, 1775, just as the news has arrived. So everybody knows that now fighting has begun, that militiamen are gathering from all over New England. Congress decides that it needs to, or it should, assert control of that army, and they look around for a general. And fortunately, one of the delegates from Virginia showed up in his militia uniform, ready to go. George Washington arrived at the Second Continental Congress, just in case, wearing his Virginia colonel's uniform. And lo and behold, he gets the appointment as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. John Adams makes sure that he's the one that nominates him. There's a whole set of politics that goes into why it's Washington, not least of which that he is not a New Englander, that one of the goals of Congress and people who support fighting the British want to make sure that this is not seen as just a Boston problem or just a New England problem, which is one of the arguments that the British are making, is this is just some rabble-rousers in Boston. If we take care of them, everything else will be calm, and it never quite works that way. So as we know from where we are sitting today, 250 years later, the battles have long-lasting impact as the beginning of the Revolutionary War. A little over a year later, Congress moves to declare independence. There's a shift from we are fighting for defense of our rights as part of the British Empire and under the British Crown to, nope, we're going to be independent, which is finalized in 1783 through the Treaty of Paris. But the memory of Lexington and Concord persists through the years. So I just want to, as we sort of wind down to the end, point out some things that may be familiar, but sort of put these in context. So in the 1830s, Ralph Waldo Emerson composes what's known as the Concord Hymn. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled, here once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. Later, after the Civil War, the artist and sculptor Daniel Chester French, who's also known for his sculptures of John Harvard and Harvard Yard and one of the memorials, Lincoln. He's the statue of Abraham Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial. He sculpted the Minuteman statue that is at North Bridge in Concord. And so, especially in New England, the idea of this Minuteman, the farmer, and you can see in the image of the way that French sculpted it, he's standing with one hand holding a gun and the other resting on a plow. This real emphasis on ordinary Americans stood up in defense of their rights. They weren't vicious, they weren't vengeful, they were ordinary farmers, they were ordinary people who were pushed into extraordinary action. The other piece that becomes famous is Paul Revere's Ride, which was not particularly well known through much of the 19th century, Revere was a locally known figure in Boston, but not that far beyond, until 1860, when Henry Wadsworth Longfellow published in the Atlantic Monthly, the magazine that still exists, a poem called Paul Revere's Ride. Um, and I was not asked to memorize it, but I would not be surprised if there's a few people on the Zoom tonight who still could do one or more stanzas by memory. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere on the 18th of April in 75. Hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. And then goes and tells the story of Revere riding, creates much of the mythology of Paul Revere. Um, of his actions and the way that he was calling out. And I included the final stanza just to give you a sense of wrapping up. So through the night rode Paul Revere, and so through the night went his cry of alarm to every Middlesex village and farm, a cry of defiance and not of fear, a voice in the darkness and knock at the door, and a word that shall echo forevermore. For born on the night wind of the past, through all our history to the last, in the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will waken and listen to hear the hurrying hoofbeats of that steed and the midnight message of Paul Revere. He published that poem in December of 1860 um, as a very clear call for American unity at a moment when the country was, as you know, falling apart. So Longfellow was trying to use the memory of Paul Revere and the memory of the American Revolution as a way of creating a message of unity, creating a message um, of togetherness, of working together, and of a message of someone issuing a call to arms and security at a moment of peril. And that seems it's not the usual place where we leave Lexington and Concord, and it's not the usual context that we think about Paul Revere and his ride. But it is nonetheless an important one for us to think about. So with that, I will very briefly show you my last slide, which has some of my contact info. Um, I thank you for your time and your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions, and we'll stop sharing and have a chat.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Adelman. That was fantastic. And I'm going to remind everyone, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and I'll be happy to read them out. And while we're waiting, I actually have a couple questions for you.
Sure.
I'm really curious. So and correct me if I'm wrong, but if I understood you earlier, you mentioned that this myth that we have that Paul Revere would have been yelling, the British are coming, the British are coming, when in fact, because they associated themselves as being British, they would not have said that. But you also show an example where the term Americans was used in May.
Mhm.
So when did that term Americans come into use, and how was it viewed at the time?
Um, so that's a let me try and get my answer down from 4 hours to 2 minutes. Um, so the term America and American goes back, obviously, even in the 1770s, 2.5, 3 centuries, um, in European and North American history. Um, it's in a moment of transition in the Revolutionary era, in part because of what's happening with the imperial crisis. Excuse me. Um, so in its earliest iterations, way back in the 16th century, being American meant being indigenous, being native, and it meant being not civilized according to English standards. Um, so that begins to transition that the colonists do think of themselves as American in some ways. And that becomes more true in the 18th century, that they turn the term American into a term that refers to the white English, mostly English settlers of the British colonies refer to themselves as Americans in some ways. Um, but it's very unclear that that's the going to be the permanent meaning. And in some ways, it's a projected uh, meaning. If they're trying to create an America, right, right. Somebody like Thomas, I think, is the one that was using it in the example I showed, right, where he's crying out, Americans, defend your liberty. Um, he's trying to create an audience. He's trying to create Americanness, um, by putting it out there. If you're reading this, you're an American, and therefore you're on our team, not their team. So I think that's kind of, and it's very much in transition at this moment, and up in the air for what it means because of all the debates about the imperial crisis and what that was going to lead to.
Mhm. Okay. All right. Well, we do have a couple questions in the chat. So here's the first one. What was the immediate reaction around the world to events in Lexington and Concord?
Well, this is being recorded and I think closed caption, so I won't just shrug, but I think that's the base. So early on, history is contingent. It's not clear in 1775 that what happens in Lexington is going to lead to a new nation called the United States. Not even a little bit. It is one small civil disturbance inside an empire, which is a common thing that happens, that there's these small disturbances within these imperial powers, Britain, France, Spain, um, that they face every now and again. Um, so the French, the Spanish, or that's the Dutch, the extent of people who would care about what's happening to English and British interests, it's a small disturbance inside the British Empire for the British to figure out and deal with. Um, Up high in the government, they might be keeping an eye on it because they're always looking for an advantage with one another, but they're not going to get involved in the internal affairs in the same way that they don't want Britain or Spain, right? The French don't want Britain or Spain to get involved in their affairs. So there actually isn't much reaction. It becomes important in retrospect rather than at that moment.
Mhm. And is this in part, an influence on when the French enter and support us?
Um, it's not because that happens so much later. So
Okay.
the Americans don't even reach out to France until after independence. Um, and so well, one of the key things to remember is that the American colonists are British colonists, and as British colonists, they've been ingesting anti-French propaganda for 100 years.
Ah. Mhm.
Um, and in some ways, New Englanders hate the French more than like anybody else. So it takes some things, some changes for New Englanders, for British Americans to be willing to approach the French as an ally. And that's something that it's after independence, they put Franklin on a ship and send him over to negotiate. And it's not until early 1778 that they actually sign agreements.
Mhm. Okay. All right. Our next question. What are your recommended reads about the revolution
Ooh.
for the lay person? And I'm gonna add to this fiction as well as nonfiction.
Oh gosh. Okay, well, it's old, but the book, this is my family's running joke of how many times I read Johnny Tremain when I was a kid, but it's an old classic, but I read Johnny Tremain too many times. Um, well, when I was a kid, I remember reading April Morning by Howard Fast about Lexington and Concord. These are all old books. What are some more recent books? So Alex Myers wrote a book called Revolutionary, which is about a fictionalized account of the experiences of Deborah Sampson, who was a woman who cross-dressed as a man to fight in the Continental Army late in the war. I read that pretty recently, and that was excellent. Um, in terms of nonfiction, if we're looking overviews, Woody Holton has a book called Liberty is Sweet. Um, Pauline Mayer's book, American Scripture and the Declaration of Independence, is fantastic. I should be writing these down because the next thing that's going to happen is somebody's going to say, put these in the chat. Um, Pauline Mayer, Woody Holton. Um, Specifically on the Boston Massacre, a book that's really fantastic in the last couple of years is a book called The Boston Massacre by Serena Zabin. Um, Mary Beth Norton has a fantastic book about 1774, and sort of the long crisis of 1774. The title of that book is 1774. Um, what other? I try to avoid Revolutionary era fiction because it's like too resonant for me. So when I'm reading fiction, I try to go somewhere else. Um, so now I have to think of I might have to think of what else worked, but Lisa, if you email me, I'll have some time to think and come up with a better answer.
Okay,
Or
all right.
names.
I'll move on to the next question then. Okay. The docent at the Golden Ball Tavern in Weston remarked that Tory spies at the tavern may have been responsible for Concord being chosen by the British instead of Worcester to be rated for cannons and arms. Any truth to that?
Yep. So they are, I think the same spies go out once they go to Worcester and once they go to Concord. The Golden Ball, I did a talk there last month, was run by a loyalist, by a Tory, and so they were quite welcome there at that particular tavern, uh, when they stopped. And yeah, they made multiple trips. One they went to Worcester and one they went to Concord, and they identified Concord as a site that was a particular storage site for colonial arms and especially those. So Boston was big enough that it had an artillery company as part of its militia. And so they had four relatively small, but they had four cannon that disappeared from Boston, and they figured out that at least a couple of them had ended up in Concord. And so that was part of the motivation to go to Concord. So yes.
Okay. Renee has a related question to the one I believe earlier about the world reaction to Lexington and Concord. She asks a parallel question. What was the reaction among the colonists to these events? And I'm kind of curious if did Southern colonists react differently than Northern?
Yes, so there's variety. So there's a whole bunch of different directions to go. Um, Loyalists didn't like it wherever they were. Um, Patriots tended to warm to it. So the first thing that should pop in my head is that the reaction to the Boston Tea Party was far more negative, um, than I think Bostonians now are willing to admit. Sorry. Um, I grew up in New York, so I'm perfectly fine to tell Bostonians that they are overestimating themselves. Um, there were a lot of people who said, the Boston Tea Party actually that was a terrible idea. Washington writes a famous letter where he includes a note of like, it was a terrible idea. But then the British overreacted, and so yeah, now I'm on their side because they had their port closed, and sort of the reaction was so overdone that they drew to that. There were people who were itching. Washington showed up in his militia uniform. He was rip raring to go, um, and so people who supported the Patriot side already, um, I think they had varying degrees of projecting reluctance or eagerness to be in the fight. But there were a number of people who by 1775 had gotten to the point where they thought that that was what the solution was going to be. So there were somewhat more loyalists in a variety of places. So New York City, actually, had a fairly significant loyalist population. Uh, a number of places in the South. Philadelphia had a very class stratified political system. The elites tended to either be loyalist or neutral because of their Quaker faith. Right, pacifism is one of the key tenets of the Society of Friends, and people who adhered to that tended to try and say we're neutral, we're not getting involved either way. Um, and so the Patriot group tended to be the work in Philadelphia was the working class almost entirely, where in Boston it was spread throughout, right? There's silversmiths and printers like Paul Revere and Benjamin Eads, and there's also John Hancock's, and Dr. Benjamin Church and Joseph Warren and really elite people. Um, so there's it's I hesitate to say, my students hate when I say this, but every historian's answer can be it's complicated, and so of course that's true for this. Um, but in general, people who probably were ready for the fight anyway, were fine with it. And right, Congress convenes and they create an army. They don't disparage the Massachusetts militiamen. They don't tell them they're on their own. Uh, they appoint Washington as head of a continental army and send them north.
Okay. Well, so I'm curious, uh, what was the approximate breakdown of loyalists versus patriots? Was it
Where?
50-50? Well, well, throughout the 13 colonies, because I'm curious to know, were the patriots just a smaller group that really won support over time?
The Patriots were probably a larger group. So the estimates that I tend to use, because we don't have exact numbers, right? There's not like party registrations or things like that.
Right.
Um, Give or take across what ends up being the United States, across that geography, probably something like 40%-ish were patriot leaning. Probably about 20%-ish were loyalist leaning, and about that leaves about 40% who were somewhere in between, who were neutral, who just didn't want to be involved, who were, a pox on both your houses, um, varying opinions that just they didn't take a particular side. So the Patriots are stronger. They are absolutely stronger in New England, um, by comparison to loyalists than in other parts of the colonies. Um, and keep in mind, there's another 13 colonies that the Continental Congress tries to make outreach to colonies in Canada and a little bit, at least, to the West Indies, to places like Jamaica and Barbados. And those places have no interest in joining the rebellion.
Okay. I'm going to keep this, sorry, um, what I hope to be the last question for you, so we can all
And
wrap up at
and
8.
Tom McAndrew is confirming that at least I agree with Mary Beth Norton. He very distinguished, much more distinguished than me, historian of the American Revolution, also has that 40-20-40 split.
Okay, so I'm really curious. You mentioned religious reasons for the loyalists. Were there other reasons? Why would they want to remain loyal to Britain? Were the reasons economic?
It's important to remember that that was the default.
Okay.
The Patriots were the weird ones. The Patriots were the radicals. The default is you grew up in a British colony, you grew up as a subject of George III. Sorry, I'm flipping your question on its head, right?
Mhm.
But the real question is, why would anyone want to leave the British Empire? Why would anyone
Mhm.
rebel against the king to whom you are subject? That doesn't happen. You don't do that. So the reason, in some ways, the reasons for loyalism are much easier to explain. They're right. It's status quo. It's we want to continue to exist in the system in which we've existed. That doesn't mean necessarily that they liked the policies. Um, Lots of people who we identify as loyalists, going back 10 years earlier, hated the Stamp Act. They didn't like it. They didn't want to pay that tax either.
Can you stop that for a second? Stop.
But their argument was this is the empire of which we are part. We're a part of a colony. You respect the governor's authority, you respect the king's authority, and that's what you do. And it was the Patriots, it was the Samuel Adamses pushing and nudging against that, who were making the much more radical claim.
Mhm. All right.
Sorry to turn your question inside out,
No,
but
no, no. I'm grateful for the clarification. I think the way you worded it probably makes more sense. Obviously, I'm gonna defer to you in this case. So, but this was a great speech. I mean, a great talk. It just really appreciate your time tonight, and I hope everyone enjoyed it.
yeah, thank you all. And like I said earlier, I'm happy to be in touch with people if they want to reach out through the various ways to find me online.
Wonderful. Well, I hope we have you again. Maybe in the fall if we're lucky. But I'm certain we'll have you again at some point.
Be
So
delighted.
until
Always.
then. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your time, everyone, and have a great night.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you. Great
Thank
lecture.
you.
Good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.